I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like, all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And we're happily joined in this conversation by Professor Josh Meyers of Howard University's Afro-American Studies Department. We'll link to his work and some of his bio so people can be more in touch with him. But we wanted to talk with him about something he had written last year in tribute to someone who is always deserving of tribute, the late, great Cedric Robinson. So Josh, welcome, or Dr. Meyers, thank you and welcome, and thanks for joining me.
You're doing this fine, brother.
But let's start with a discussion of Cedric Robinson. Tell us, if you would, in short, who he was and who he still is, and then I do want to follow up and ask you more broadly about what he meant by the Black radical tradition.
Absolutely. Cedric Robinson was a political theorist. He was one of the principal voices behind kind of the theoretical thrust of Black studies. He came of age in the late 1950s, early 1960s as a student, activist at Berkeley. He then, followed a lot of the movement to revolutionary nationalism with, the Revolutionary Action Movement. Before that, of course, he was involved with organizations around the Afro-American Association, people like Donald Ward and Leslie and Jim Lacey and others like that. So it's a very interesting background. If you trace it, many of the people that were also connected to these groups, like Malana Karenga and Huey Newton, Herbie Seal, Cedric Robinson was right there with them. He decided to study political theory, I think, in large measure to kind of resolve some of the tensions around ideology in these particular movements. What does it actually mean to actually be a Marxist or actually be a revolutionary, what have you? And so by the time he gets his PhD, many of some of the big ideological fights had been going on for a while in Black power, Black nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, however you define it. And he gets his PhD from Stanford in political theory. And he writes a dissertation that basically, destroys political science as an idea, as an orderly and rational idea. And that was published later on in a revised form in the book, The Terms of Order, which, interestingly enough, Robin Kelly, who talks about Robinson a lot, who was inspired by him, often talked about how, and others talked about how he had a lot of books, or a few books with Black in the title that got a lot more play than the books that did not have Black in the title. But in some ways, you have to read his work as part of a whole. And at least to his most well-known book, Black Marxism, which was published in 1983, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about. And he's also the author of 3 more books. So Black Movements in America, which came next in the 90s, and the Anthropology of Marxism, which came in 2001. And then his final work, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, and a slew of articles that really detail some of these theoretical pursuits. So very much involved in a number of different arenas. He never stopped being an activist. Another thing that a lot of people may not know about him, especially on the East Coast, because we're kind of alienated with what's happening on the West. So he never stopped being an activist. He was involved in a number of different organizations. He also was a radio host and a TV host. One of the things that I'm sure resonate with you out in California. So a lot of different things we can say about him.
Well, thank you for that, and I definitely identify, at least with that last part, and I try to identify with his intellectual part, but as you've written and others have talked about, it's such a high standard. And you describe Black Marxism, which I'll just hold up here, just in case anybody missed it, as an essential text, as are his others. I don't want to discount that, but I admit I'm more familiar with Black Marxism, as are, I think, a lot of other people who talk about him. And, if you would, talk about that, because the subtitle of the book, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, is, I think, key. And what I think he did with this book is fascinating. And you're writing about it, you called it a tour de force. if you could talk a little bit about why you described it in that way, and then a little bit more about what you think he meant by Black radical tradition.
Sure. And the title is, of course, signifying. If you think about it, he's not trying to, as a lot of people tend to assume, he's not trying to narrate Black people's use of Marxism as much as he is trying to deal with what the subtitle suggests. And that is how the Black radical tradition comes into being. But it's an interesting text because it does a lot more than that. My students have been dealing with it. I've been teaching it since, my first semester of teaching about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's doing a lot of different things. The first thing that it's doing is it's kind of deprovincializing this notion of, or provincializing, I should say, this notion of Western radicalism, which it comes out of a specific genealogy, and I think that is critical. It's not a universalized idea when you think about where it comes from. Then the second thing that he's doing, he's providing a foundation for Black revolutionary traditions. And one of the things that becomes very clear by the time you get to part 2, among all the different things that he's doing, he's suggesting that a revolutionary tradition that comes out of the Black experience did not need the theories that came from other places. All it needed was the deep political and spiritual foundations that emerged from African people's resolve to be free. And the problem becomes, by the 20th century, how do Black theorists engage that tradition as opposed to traditions that have been emerging from different and other revolutionary traditions. By the end of the book, he talks about how this doesn't necessarily mean that the Black radical tradition is the only radical tradition. But by the end of the book, he says it is the one, that does exist and must be part of any humane world or global change and shift that actually frees people. He says, for now, we must be as one. It's the last sentence of the book. I think it speaks to a profound desire to link Black revolutionary change to a tradition that precedes, I should say, the revolutionary traditions that are written about by the 19th century and the 20th century in Europe. And that's the most difficult part for many people to kind of understand, because what it's saying is that Black people's humanity and Black people's ideas can stand alone. And that's the difficult thing. That's the difficult thing, because most of the Western radical tradition, and particularly as it deals with the question of race, it needs Black people as adjuncts. It needs Black people as the demonstration that we too can talk about race. But what Robinson says, no, race is already there. In fact, the term that he uses is racial capitalism to speak to the really inability, not only the inability, but the undesirability of ever talking about race as separate from capitalism. He says, one of the things that he says in the first part of the book is that, racism actually preceded the introduction of the Negro, right? And so when we talk about the internal dynamics, the internal racisms of Europe, he says it's actually grafted onto feudalism. So it's necessarily, it follows that capitalism would kind of incorporate these native racisms. And then once you get the Negro, which he describes as, a person that has no history, no culture, no situatedness in time, the construction of that ideal, right? It becomes very easy for them to make, Africans the foundation of a new modern system, because it already existed in in the cultures that pre-existed in the West. So that's just a small snippet.
I mean, I think you did a great job there, because as you said, I mean, it's so broad. And I was trying to find, first of all, I picked out the book and trying to be somewhat prepared for today, and I found all my old notes in it, and found old index cards dropping out of it, and all like with scribblings on it. Like, I was really trying to work with this book, man. And I wanted to try to find, if I could, just one piece that I thought would work for this conversation as a transition to where I want us to end. But there were so many. I mean, there's just so much to draw from. But I'll try with this one. And in this section on Du Bois,
okay,
he's what I like what he was trying to do in league with what you were just describing was say, there is an unchanging relationship that African descended people have with the West that, as you said, was enhanced or grafted onto older forms. And so he's talking about how Du Bois was eventually trying to deal with this. And he was talking about, I think, the development, the Western North American development starting in the 18th century. And he says, quote, during the era that followed, when manufacturing became the most advanced form of production and democratic institutions the most significant political creed, the African was represented as chattel in their economic image, as slaves in their political and social image, as brutish and therefore inaccessible to further development, and finally as Negro, that is, without history. And later, during the industrialization of the country's economy, when individuality and manipulative acumen were at a premium, the black was a pathetic sharecropper, unskilled and unambitious, the happy darkies for whom the society possessed a paternalistic obligation. Finally, in our own time, with the development of corporate structures and the myth of intensively rationalized and rational society, blacks became the irrational, the violent, criminal, caged beast. The cage was civilization and Western culture, obviously available to blacks, but inexplicably beyond their grasp, end quote.
And I had that page marked too, so.
Yeah, I mean, because what I wanted to ask you was, why would you or I and so many others, but unfortunately not enough, find relevance in Robinson's work for today? What is he saying, or what is he saying about the black radical tradition that could and should still inform us today? Because even as you said, he wrote this in the 80s. I mean, that is exactly where we are right now. And still, as I would argue, in need of the kind of approach and analysis he's offering. So,
just to start where you started in terms of his reading of Du Bois is still relevant. And then when he was writing this in 1983, to follow one of my teachers, grad school instructors, Anthony Montero, people weren't dealing with Du Bois in 1983 like they are trying or attempting to do now, right? And so there's a very specific way in which Du Bois becomes less of a radical and more of a liberal civil rights kind of leader in the moments that he is reattached to the American canon after the Cold War, right? He becomes useful after the Cold War for people, right? But Robinson and others like Gerald Horne and Manny Marable and many others, Angela Davis, have been really looking at Du Bois as an extension, had in many ways saw their work as an extension of Du Bois in the 70s and the 1980s. But here, I think what Du Bois is basically establishing, talking about Black Reconstruction in America, talking about suppression, his dissertation, is that, racism is at the foundation of this thing that we call democracy in America. And if we can't deal with that in ways that demonstrate how it's functional and how it actually works, then we're ultimately simply becoming liberalized versions of Black traditions that don't really free anybody. All they do is simply reduce the basic antagonism at the heart of America to something that's ambiguous or something that is an aberration, right? Robinson and others are saying, no, it's actually central to what you actually define as America, what you define as nation, what you define as the function of capitalism, right? And so that section that you just read comes out of a section called National Myths, right? Du Bois in the myths of myths of national history. And so one of those myths, of course, is the Negro, right? It defines what the nation is. It defines how we understand citizenship. It defines so many things that we take for granted. But by affirming American values, you're also affirming the Negro, right? And that's why you see in that paragraph, those different forms in which the Negro takes are not accidental. They're actually foundational. So when we think about the Black radical tradition in this particular moment, the struggle becomes very clear, right? The struggle becomes, as he says at the end of the terms of order, we have to find a new way of realizing ourselves, right? That goes beyond the liberal narratives, that go beyond even the American national narratives about how we come to understand the question of racism, how we understand the antagonisms at the heart of the modern world, really, because it's not just the United States. When you think about his work, it's actually a global concern. And so as these particular moments, we find ourselves dealing with the outgrowth of like white nationalism or the outgrowth of neocolonialism, the various manifestations of the modern world that Africans and also other people of color in the world find themselves. I think his work, by framing it as racial capitalism, by framing the Black radical tradition as a broad, systemic, and frontal assault on the very meaning of racial capitalism, helps us better kind of situate ourselves in understanding how we might see the future, as Sylvia Wynter says, beyond man or after man, right? After modern man, after this kind of instantaneation of this notion of Blackness and Negroness, right? So I think that's the clear use for this word in this particular moment.
Let me just ask very quickly, if you don't mind, just as quick as we can. One other thing I did want to touch on, it's in the title, Black Marxism. One of the things that I like that he does here is that in his critique of Marx, he acknowledges the benefit to that analysis. He acknowledges its positive impact on a lot of people around the world and its value, but then, of course, demonstrates its limitations, particularly as you've already outlined, when it's confronted with a Black radical tradition that pre-exists or predates what people now call Marx or Marxism. But I don't know. What does he actually say about Marxism? How would you summarize what he says about Marx and Marxism, and how the broader African world should or has related to that?
Well, in short, two things I'll say. The first thing is Marx's ideas hinge on Europe's national identity, and Europeans' national identity. And so if you look at part one of the text, one of the things that compromises this as a universal theory is that the retreat to national identities in moments of crisis often prevent any sort of working class, any pretense towards working class unity, right? And those nationalisms, of course, proceed from racisms, right? You only think of yourself as a nation because you think yourself as different from others, right? Which is the kind of notion of difference. At the same time, critics have looked at, the basic fact that, well, Du Bois and James and others, they never really abandoned Marxism, right? They never really, go beyond it in some ways, right? But what Robinson is saying here is that, for them, the uplift tradition, or the notion of, as he says, Black Victorianism, was the first kind of assault that these, what he calls the Black radical intelligentsia, had, found themselves arrayed against. And the second part was they found in Marxism a critical lens to that kind of liberal colonial, of those liberal colonial systems. And so for them, it was a valuable kind of tool to kind of deal with the dominant modes of power. And yet, as they entered into these particular, theoretical and conceptual systems that, under the broad umbrella of Marxism, they also began to see that there's some things that it could not fully explain. And, for Du Bois, it was, the notion of Africans seeing the coming of emancipation as the coming of the Lord. Like, there's no place in Marxism to make sense of it. Or for James, it was this notion of Vodun as the medium of the conspiracy of the Haitian Revolution. There's no Marxian language for that. And then, of course, for Richard Wright, it was the blues and the jazz and these notions of African culture that really had no foundation in European theory. And in order to understand that, you needed a different frame, needed a different lens. And I think Robinson conceived that there were precious insights in Marxism, but he doesn't see it as a total system of or a grand theory of how to understand the world. Because to make that claim, one would have to kind of reduce African culture, African ways of knowing, African ways of perceiving that which is just in the world to the dustbin of history. And I think chapter 7, the nature of the Black radical tradition, really drove this home for me. And it's it's the shortest chapter. It's probably the one we spend the most time in class talking about, because the things that our students can't initially wrap their heads around is the calling card, if you will, the Black radical tradition is the absence of mass violence. Right? And then it becomes, wait a minute, did our people retreat? And if retreat is the foundation of the Black radical tradition, then what is the Black radical tradition really about? And what we find is that it's about reconstitution. It's about the ability to survive as free and based on our own terms. And oftentimes, open violence or open revolt wasn't the best means to do that. It was actually maroonage. It was actually about separation, right? Because what we were actually resisting is not just racial capitalism. We're resisting, as Robinson says, Western civilization.
And I think as Bob Marley once said, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. I think that fits right there. Dr. Meyers, I appreciate you, man. Thank you for joining us and helping us unpack at least a little bit of Cedric Robinson's work, man. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. As Fred Hampton used to say, to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.